Hollywood, WWE, and the music world are reeling from the heartbreaking loss of three iconic figures: Hulk Hogan, Ozzy Osbourne, and Malcolm-Jamal Warner. Their contributions shaped generations, and their sudden passing has left fans in shock worldwide. In this emotional tribute, we look back at their unforgettable careers, iconic moments, and the lasting impact they've left on entertainment history. Whether you grew up watching Hogan in the ring, listening to Ozzy's legendary rock anthems, or following Malcolm-Jamal's classic TV performances, this video is a heartfelt celebration of their legacies. It began as one of those mornings where the world felt just a little heavier, though no one yet knew why. But within hours, the headlines began to cascade, stark black text against pale news feeds, each one more devastating than the last. Hollywood, WWE, the music world. Three arenas of culture that rarely collide, now bound by shared grief. Three names legendary in their own right, spoken in whispers, in disbelief, in tears: Hulk Hogan, Ozzy Osbourne, Malcolm-Jamal Warner. Gone. All in the span of days, as if the universe had decided to draw the curtain early on three of the most vibrant performers to ever step into their respective spotlights. For millions, this was more than just a news update. It was the loss of pieces of their own history. For wrestling fans, the mention of Hulk Hogan was a time machine back to the roaring crowds of the 1980s, the blinding flashbulbs of WrestleMania, the larger-than-life charisma of the man in red and yellow, cupping his ear to a sea of screaming believers. For rock enthusiasts, Ozzy Osbourne was rebellion personified, the Prince of Darkness who somehow turned chaos into anthems that defined entire generations of outsiders, dreamers, and misfits. And for television lovers, Malcolm-Jamal Warner wasn't just an actor. He was a part of the family, the familiar face you'd welcome into your living room week after week, shaping the cultural language of an era. The news hit like a triple thunderclap. One moment, the memories were safe, preserved in old matches, vinyl records, and TV reruns. The next, those memories felt different, heavier. They were no longer tied to living legends, but to legacies. And that shift, that cruel transformation from is to was, rippled through fans across continents. Candlelight vigils began springing up in cities within hours. Social media feeds flooded with grainy throwback photos, hastily typed tributes, and clips replayed over and over. Hashtags like #ThankYouHogan, #LongLiveOzzy, and #FarewellMalcolm began trending globally, blending into a collective digital mourning that transcended fandom boundaries. It was almost too much to process. These weren't just celebrities, they were fixtures of different worlds, each a lighthouse for their own audience. Hogan, the face of a wrestling boom that made the sport a household spectacle. Ozzy, the embodiment of rock's defiance and theatrical madness. Malcolm-Jamal, the steady heartbeat of one of television's most beloved families. Each carried a different kind of influence, but all shared the rare ability to make people feel. Whether it was the adrenaline of a title match, the rush of a guitar solo, or the comfort of a familiar smile on screen. In a way, their passings seemed impossible because they had each built personas that felt immortal. Hogan was the unstoppable hero, the man who could hulk up and overcome anything. Ozzy was the indestructible survivor, cheating death and expectation in equal measure. Malcolm-Jamal was the ever-present friend, aging gracefully with his audience, evolving but never truly leaving. And yet, mortality spares no legend, no matter how bright their star burns. Today, we remember them not just for their careers, but for the moments that stitched them into our lives. The championship wins. The music that got us through heartbreaks and wild nights. The episodes that made us laugh and cry when we didn't even realize we needed it. This is not a farewell built of cold facts and timelines. This is a story about impact, about connection, about what it means to share decades of your life, unknowingly, with millions of strangers, and to leave them changed when you're gone. We begin where the cheers were deafening, where muscles and morality combined into a symbol of a generation's optimism. The ring, the man, the legend, Hulk Hogan. If you grew up in the 1980s or 1990s, Hulk Hogan wasn't just a wrestler. He was the wrestler, the gold standard, the name your parents knew even if they never watched a single match. The figure who transformed professional wrestling from smoky arenas and regional TV slots into a mainstream cultural phenomenon broadcast to millions. To talk about Hogan is to talk about the moment wrestling stopped being a niche sport and became an international spectacle. Terry Gene Bollea, the man beneath the mustache, bandana, and bravado, was born on August 11, 1953, in Augusta, Georgia, but it was Clearwater, Florida, where his legend truly began to take shape. Towering at 6 feet 7 inches and weighing over 300 pounds, Hogan was a presence you couldn't ignore. But it wasn't just his size, it was his aura, his deep, booming voice. The way he spoke directly to all my Hulkamaniacs, as if you were part of his inner circle. From the moment he stepped into the World Wrestling Federation, now WWE, he radiated something rare. A blend of superhero invincibility and approachable charisma. Hogan's rise to fame was meteoric. When he defeated the Iron Sheik in January 1984 to win his first WWF Championship, it wasn't just a title change, it was the start of the Hulkamania era. Crowds erupted, kids waved foam fingers, and the chant of Hogan, Hogan became an anthem. The formula was simple but effective. Hogan would take a beating, look like he was on the verge of defeat, and then, like clockwork, he'd hulk up, shaking with adrenaline, pointing that finger and unleashing a final wave of offense that left his opponent flattened. It was storytelling at its purest, and the fans ate it up. He became the face of WrestleMania, headlining the very first event in 1985 and going on to main event 8 of the first 9 shows. His bouts with Andre the Giant, Macho Man Randy Savage, and the Ultimate Warrior are etched into wrestling history. The image of Hogan body-slamming Andre at WrestleMania 3, 93,173 fans screaming in unison, is arguably one of the most replayed moments in sports entertainment. But Hogan wasn't just a ring general, he was a crossover star. He appeared in movies like No Holds Barred and Suburban Commando, guest starred on TV shows, and became a marketing powerhouse with action figures, lunchboxes, and even his own Saturday morning cartoon. In the world of pop culture, he stood alongside action heroes like Schwarzenegger and Stallone, only his battles played out in the squared circle. Yet, behind the unstoppable persona, Hogan's life was far from invincible. His career weathered controversies, from steroid scandals to backstage politics, and his personal life was often splashed across tabloids. But somehow, he always seemed to rebound. Fans forgave. The industry embraced him again and again, whether in his shocking heel turn to lead the NWO in WCW, changing wrestling forever in 1996, or his emotional return to WWE years later. In the final chapters of his life, Hogan embraced the role of elder statesman for wrestling. He appeared at Hall of Fame ceremonies, mentored younger talent, and spoke candidly about his mistakes, his health battles, and his gratitude for the fans who had stuck by him. His voice had grown a little softer, his frame a little leaner, but when he cupped his hand to his ear, the crowd still roared like it was 1985. News of his passing spread first through the wrestling community, where fellow legends and modern superstars alike posted tributes. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson called him the reason I fell in love with wrestling. John Cena wrote, "Without Hulk Hogan, there is no WWE as we know it." Fans shared stories of meeting him at conventions, of watching WrestleMania with their fathers, of wearing the red and yellow to school and feeling like they could take on the world. In Clearwater, where he had lived for decades, locals gathered outside his beachfront home, laying flowers and lighting candles. Some brought old championship belts, placing them on the sand as a kind of offering. Others simply stood in silence, staring at the waves, perhaps remembering the man who made them believe in heroes. Hulk Hogan's legacy isn't just in the matches or the merchandise. It's in the idea that sometimes the good guy can win. That resilience matters. That even after the body slams, the betrayals, and the hard knocks of life, you can hulk up and keep going. And now, though the man himself has left the ring for the final time, the echo of his theme music, the roar of the crowd, and the lessons of Hulkamania will live on not just in wrestling history, but in the hearts of everyone who once believed when he told them to say their prayers and take their vitamins. In the weeks leading up to his passing, those closest to Hulk Hogan noticed a change in him. Not in his spirit, which still burned bright, but in the way he seemed to be preparing for something. He had always been a storyteller, a man who loved to relive old matches and road tales, but now the story seemed to take on a different weight. Friends recalled late-night calls where Hogan would drift into quiet reflection, talking about the early days when he was just a young man trying to make it in the rough, unforgiving world of professional wrestling. One of his longtime friends, Mean Gene Okerlund, had once said that Hogan's secret wasn't just his size or charisma, but the way he made you feel like part of his journey. And in those final conversations, Hogan seemed determined to make sure that journey was understood, not just as a rise to fame, but as a long, winding road filled with triumphs, mistakes, comebacks, and lessons learned the hard way. He would talk about his father, Pietro, who taught him the value of hard work, and his mother, Ruth, whose quiet support grounded him even in the wildest years of his fame. He'd laugh about the night he wrestled in front of barely 50 people at a fairground, eating cold hot dogs afterward because there wasn't enough money for a real meal. Then his voice would grow softer as he recalled the night at Madison Square Garden when the crowd's roar was so loud during his entrance that he could feel it vibrating in his chest. By now, Hogan's knees bore the scars of countless surgeries, his back ached from decades of slams, and the toll of being the Immortal had become painfully real. Yet, even as his body slowed, his heart remained in the business. He attended independent shows when he could, shaking hands with young wrestlers who had grown up idolizing him, offering them advice that blended kayfabe wisdom with real-life grit. Protect your body, protect your name, and never forget who you're doing this for, the people in those seats. The last time Hogan was seen publicly was at a charity event in Tampa. Wearing a black bandana and sunglasses, he posed for photos with children, signed memorabilia, and laughed that unmistakable booming laugh. Those who were there said he seemed genuinely happy, not the kind of happiness you fake for cameras, but a man who had made peace with his place in history. It was only later, after the news broke, that fans realized how precious those final moments had been. When word of his death spread, the wrestling world reacted instantly. WWE aired a 10-minute tribute package at the start of Monday Night Raw, opening with a slow, familiar strum of Real American. The arena fell into silence as images of Hogan in his prime filled the giant screen, flexing in victory, pointing to the crowd, raising the championship belt high above his head. Superstars stood on the stage, many visibly emotional, as the montage ended with a simple graphic: Hulk Hogan 1953 to 2025. AEW, Impact Wrestling, and countless independent promotions also paid tribute, proving that Hogan's impact went far beyond one company. In an era where rival promotions often guarded their own, the unity in honoring him spoke volumes about his reach. Across the globe, fans organized their own memorials. In Japan, wrestling fans gathered in Tokyo's Korakuen Hall, holding up yellow bandanas during a 10-bell salute. In the UK, screenings of No Holds Barred sold out within hours as fans sought to relive his silver screen moments. Social media was flooded with personal tributes from wrestlers past and present. Ric Flair called him the ultimate showman and my greatest rival. Triple H wrote, "There will never be another like him. He changed the game forever." Even younger talents who had never shared the ring with him, like Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins, posted heartfelt messages about the way Hogan's matches inspired them as children. But the most poignant tributes came from the fans who had grown up in the era of Hulkamania. Stories poured in about fathers bonding with their children over Saturday morning wrestling, about kids who gained confidence because they believed in Hogan's "say your prayers and take your vitamins" mantra. One man posted a photo of his childhood bedroom, still decorated with Hogan posters 3 decades later. "He made me believe I could be a hero," the caption read. In Clearwater Beach, Hogan's adopted hometown, hundreds gathered for an impromptu candlelight vigil. The crowd stretched along the shoreline, the flicker of candles reflecting off the waves. At one point, a local musician began playing an acoustic version of Real American, and the entire crowd joined in, their voices carrying out over the water. It was raw, unpolished, and achingly sincere, the kind of tribute that no television special could capture. Close friends revealed that Hogan's final wishes were simple. He didn't want a grand state-like funeral. He wanted something intimate, surrounded by family, close friends, and a few of his brothers from the wrestling world. True to his request, his funeral service was held at his mansion in Clearwater, the same place he had hosted countless gatherings over the years. The guest list was kept private, but reports say that some of the biggest names in wrestling quietly attended, slipping in through the back to avoid the paparazzi. Inside, the decor reflected the two sides of Hulk Hogan, the performer and the man. On one side of the room, his red and yellow ring gear was displayed alongside championship belts, classic photos, and magazine covers. On the other side, there were family photographs, Hogan fishing with his children, laughing with friends, hugging his parents. The juxtaposition told the real story, that behind the legend was a man who valued his personal connections just as much as the roar of the crowd. The eulogies were delivered by a select few. One longtime friend spoke about the time Hogan, at the height of his fame, flew across the country to visit a sick child who had written him a letter. Another told a story about Hogan showing up unannounced at a struggling wrestler's benefit show, donating quietly and staying to watch every match. Each story reinforced a truth that wrestling fans had always suspected, that the man who played the hero on TV had a heroic streak in real life, too. As the service ended, guests stepped outside into the warm Florida evening. The sun was dipping low, casting a golden glow over the water. In a final tribute, a small group of friends carried one of Hogan's signature bandanas out to the shoreline, tying it around the post of a small wooden pier. The waves lapped gently against the wood, as if carrying the memory of Hulk Hogan out into the horizon. In the end, Hulk Hogan's life was a tapestry of contradictions. The larger-than-life hero who was also deeply human, the man who faced controversies but never lost the love of the people who grew up watching him. His passing leaves an empty space in the wrestling world, one that will never truly be filled. But as long as there are fans who remember the thrill of watching him hulk up against impossible odds, as long as children still run around in red and yellow, cupping their ears to imaginary cheers, Hulk Hogan will never truly be gone. And now, as the final echoes of his entrance music fade, we turn to another icon, one whose voice could command stadiums, whose music could shake the foundations of an entire generation, and whose life was a symphony of chaos and beauty. The Prince of Darkness himself, Ozzy Osbourne. Even for those who had never watched a single wrestling match, Hulk Hogan was a cultural constant. A figure you could recognize instantly in a crowd, a symbol of an era when heroes were larger than life, muscles were cartoonishly huge, and the lines between good and evil in the ring were drawn in bold, primary colors. His passing didn't just mark the end of a career, it felt like the loss of an entire chapter in pop culture history. In the weeks after his funeral, tributes continued to pour in from every corner of the world. Sports channels aired marathon blocks of his greatest matches, complete with commentary from his former rivals and allies. ESPN aired a 2-hour special simply titled Hogan, blending archival footage with never-before-seen backstage clips that showed a more vulnerable side of the icon, Hogan rubbing his taped wrists in quiet focus before a match, exchanging jokes with stage hands, or gently telling a young fan to keep dreaming, brother. But perhaps the most telling memorial came from the fans themselves. At WrestleMania, just weeks after his passing, WWE dimmed the stadium lights before the main event. On the giant LED screen, Hogan's face appeared, smiling beneath the bandana, as his theme song Real American played softly at first, then swelled into the familiar triumphant chords. Thousands of fans stood, holding up their hands in the Hulkamania pose, cupping their ears toward the stage. For a moment, it felt as though he was there, listening. Hogan's impact went beyond wrestling. He had a knack for transcending the limitations of his industry, turning himself into a household name in the 1980s when wrestling was still considered a niche spectacle. His television appearances, from the A-Team to Rocky III, brought him into millions of homes, while his endorsements made him a familiar face even to those who couldn't tell a body slam from a suplex. The Hulk Hogan vitamins, lunchboxes, action figures, and even the ill-fated Hulk Hogan's Pastamania restaurant chain became part of the brand that was as much about optimism and perseverance as it was about wrestling moves. The Hulkamania era was not just marketing, it was a phenomenon. Children idolized him, parents trusted him, and the industry itself rode the wave of his charisma into a period of unprecedented mainstream popularity. Without Hogan, there might not have been a WrestleMania 3 with 93,000 fans packed into the Pontiac Silverdome. There might not have been a wrestling boom that turned Vince McMahon's WWF into a global powerhouse. Of course, the man was not without his shadows. His career was marked by controversies, the steroid trial in the early 90s, publicized personal struggles, and legal battles that threatened to tarnish his legacy. But what made Hogan's story uniquely enduring was his ability to stage comebacks, both in the ring and in public perception. The Hollywood Hogan heel turn in WCW's New World Order faction is still considered one of the most brilliant reinventions in wrestling history. It proved that Hogan understood not just how to play the hero, but also how to embrace the role of the villain when the story demanded it. In his later years, when his in-ring days were over, Hogan evolved into a mentor and ambassador for the wrestling world. He was generous with his time at fan conventions, often staying hours past his scheduled meet and greets to shake hands, take photos, and share stories. For younger wrestlers, getting advice from Hogan was like getting a pep talk from the captain of a championship team. Practical, encouraging, and always ending with that signature brother that made you feel like part of the club. The last few years of his life were quieter, but still impactful. He made occasional appearances at major wrestling events, his walk slower, his voice raspier, but his smile just as bright. In interviews, he spoke openly about his health battles, admitting that the years of wrestling had taken a toll on his body. Yet, he remained grateful, saying that the sacrifices were worth it for the moments he had shared with fans. When he passed, many noted that Hogan's life mirrored the storylines he played out in the ring. He was knocked down, sometimes by opponents, sometimes by life itself, but he always hokied up, shaking off the blows and finding a way to stand tall again. And now, in death, the mythology of Hulk Hogan has merged with the man himself, cementing him not just as a wrestling icon, but as a symbol of resilience for anyone who ever felt like the odds were against them. In Clearwater, a mural appeared on the side of a downtown building just days after his passing. Painted in vivid reds and yellows, it depicted Hogan in mid-pose, one hand cupped to his ear, the other pointing toward the viewer. Above him were the words, "What you gonna do when we remember you?" Tourists and locals alike began leaving flowers, belts, and photos at the base of the wall, turning it into an unofficial memorial site. For those who loved him, Hulk Hogan wasn't just a wrestler. He was a memory they could revisit whenever they needed to believe in something bigger than themselves. And that more than titles, more than fame, is the kind of immortality that even death can't pin down. Now, with the echoes of the crowd still ringing in our ears, we turn from the roar of the arena to the thunder of guitar riffs that define generations. From the squared circle to the darkened stage, our tribute moves to another legend, one who wore black like armor, whose voice could haunt and electrify, and whose life was an anthem in itself. 2. The Prince of Darkness, Ozzy Osbourne. The stage was always his kingdom. For over half a century, Ozzy Osbourne ruled it with a presence that was equal parts chaos and charisma, a madman and a maestro, a rebel and a poet. Whether he was prowling under the blinding lights of a stadium or hunched over a studio microphone in the small hours of the morning, He embodied the raw, unpredictable energy of rock and roll. His death didn't just silence a voice. It dimmed a fire that had burned against the odds for decades. News of his passing hit the music world like a tremor. Within hours, tributes from fellow rockers, pop stars, and even classical musicians flooded social media. Some posted black and white portraits of a young Ozzy, shirtless and wide-eyed, clutching a microphone as though it might explode in his hands. Others shared footage of his more recent years. Slower in movement, but still sharp in wit, still ready with a mischievous grin that made you feel like he was about to do something outrageous. For fans, the grief was complicated. Ozzy had been living on borrowed time for so long that his survival had become part of his legend. He had cheated death repeatedly, from near-fatal overdoses and wild on-stage stunts to motorcycle crashes and serious illnesses. He once said in an interview, with that half-cackle that always bordered on a cough, "I'm like a cat, mate. I've had more lives than I can count." And somehow, each time the world thought he was finished, he'd re-emerge a little more scarred, perhaps, but just as determined to keep singing. But the news this time was final. The Prince of Darkness had taken his final bow. And for those who had grown up with his music, first with Black Sabbath, then in his storied solo career, it felt like the closing of a book they never wanted to end. John Michael Osbourne was born on December 3, 1948, in the industrial heart of Birmingham, England. He grew up in a working-class family, the fourth of 6 children, in a neighborhood where the air was thick with the smoke of factories. Life was hard, and the future for most kids there was simple: leave school early, get a job, and work until you couldn't anymore. But even as a boy, Ozzy was different. He was restless, drawn to music, to voices that came crackling through the radio, carrying with them the promise of a world beyond the factory gates. School was a struggle. Dyslexia and ADHD made academics difficult, and he left at 15, bouncing between odd jobs: a plumber's apprentice, a car horn tuner, even a slaughterhouse worker. But nothing fit. The only thing that made sense, the only thing that felt like his, was music. By the late 1960s, he found his way into a group of like-minded misfits: Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward. They started as a blues rock band called Earth, but after realizing another group was using the same name, they changed it, inspired by a local cinema showing a horror film titled Black Sabbath. The name stuck, and so did the darker, heavier sound they began to craft. It was slower, deeper, almost ominous. Where other bands sang about love and peace, Black Sabbath sang about war, madness, death, and the supernatural. And at the center of it all was Ozzy's voice, a strange, haunting wail that somehow cut through the thick walls of guitar and bass like a blade through fog. Their self-titled debut album, released in 1970, was unlike anything the music world had heard before. The opening tracks, Tolling Church Bell, the thunderstorm sound effects, the crushing riffs, it was a declaration of intent. And when Ozzy's voice entered, eerie and urgent, it was clear this was no peace and love flower power act. This was something else entirely. With albums like Paranoid, Master of Reality, and Volume 4, Black Sabbath redefined rock. They became the architects of heavy metal, influencing generations of musicians to come. Songs like Iron Man and War Pigs became anthems, with Ozzy's vocals providing the perfect counterpoint to Iommi's riffs, at once melodic and menacing. But with success came chaos. The band's lifestyle was as heavy as their music, filled with relentless touring, alcohol, and drugs. Ozzy, by his own admission, indulged more than most. The excess took its toll, leading to tensions within the band. By 1979, after a decade of groundbreaking music, Ozzy was fired from Black Sabbath. It could have been the end. Instead, it was the beginning of something even bigger. Left to his own devices, Ozzy could have faded into rock history as a cautionary tale. Instead, he teamed up with Sharon Arden, the woman who would become his wife, manager, and the steadying force in his life. Together, they assembled a new band, including the young guitar virtuoso Randy Rhoads, and in 1980, Ozzy released Blizzard of Oz. It was a triumph. Songs like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley became instant classics, blending blistering guitar work with Ozzy's unmistakable voice. The album not only cemented his place in music after Sabbath, but expanded it. Over the next decade, he released hit after hit, toured relentlessly, and built a solo career that rivaled, and in some ways surpassed, his work with the band that had made him famous. Of course, the madness followed him. Ozzy became infamous for outrageous stunts, from biting the head off a bat on stage, an incident he later explained as a misunderstanding. He thought it was a rubber toy, to urinating on the Alamo. Yet, even these moments became part of the legend, feeding the mythos of a man who seemed to operate entirely on his own terms. By the 1990s, Ozzy's life had taken more twists than most could survive. He battled addictions, injuries, and personal tragedies, including the death of Randy Rhoads in a 1982 plane crash, a loss that haunted him for the rest of his life. And yet, somehow, he kept going. A new generation discovered him in the early 2000s through The Osbournes, the reality TV show that followed Ozzy, Sharon, and their children, Kelly and Jack, through the daily chaos of life in their Beverly Hills home. The show revealed a different side of Ozzy, the bumbling, endearing dad who swore constantly and seemed perpetually confused about what was going on around him. It made him relatable to millions who might never have listened to heavy metal before. In later years, Ozzy's health struggles became more public. He battled Parkinson's disease, underwent multiple surgeries, and often had to postpone tours. But every time, he swore he'd be back on stage. And every time, for as long as he could, he was. In his final performances, Ozzy's voice may have lost some of its youthful bite, but his presence was undiminished. Standing under the lights, gripping the mic stand, he could still hold an audience in the palm of his hand. Fans didn't just cheer for the music, they cheered for the man, for everything he'd survived, for every song that had gotten them through their own battles. When he passed, rock radio stations around the world played "See You on the Other Side" in unison. Candlelit vigils were held in cities from Los Angeles to London. In Birmingham, thousands gathered in the city center to sing "Crazy Train," their voices echoing through the streets where Ozzy had once walked as a kid with no idea what his future held. Tributes from fellow musicians painted a picture of a man who was generous, funny, and fiercely loyal to his friends. Tony Iommi, his old Black Sabbath bandmate, said simply, "There was only one Ozzy, and there will never be another." Even as the years began to press more heavily against him, Ozzy Osbourne refused to let the shadows of time erase his fire. In his final months, those who saw him in person noticed the toll that decades of touring, illness, and an unrelenting rock and roll lifestyle had taken on his body. He walked more slowly now, leaning on a cane, and often required assistance when moving from place to place. But when he sat down, when the conversation turned to music, to the early days, to the roar of a crowd chanting his name, his eyes would light up again with that familiar mischief. Those close to him have since spoken of long nights spent in his private study, the walls lined with gold and platinum records, framed photographs from around the world, and a few shelves cluttered with odd trinkets he had picked up over the years. There was no neat organization, just the chaotic curation of a life lived loudly. A ceramic bat figurine here, a faded tour laminate there, a guitar pick taped to the inside of a frame. These were the artifacts of a man who had taken every twist and turn the road offered and somehow managed to spin them into melody. Sharon Osbourne, his wife and constant partner through storms both public and private, was at his side until the very end. In interviews since his passing, she has recalled the way he'd often sit with an unplugged electric guitar in his lap, gently strumming nothing in particular, humming little fragments of songs. Some were familiar riffs from his youth, others entirely new ideas that would now never become full compositions. "He never really stopped writing," she said softly. "Even when the world thought he was resting, he was creating." In the last months, his home in Los Angeles became a revolving door of visitors, old bandmates, lifelong friends, and musicians he had mentored over the decades. Tony Iommi came by to sit with him in the garden, the two men reminiscing about Birmingham, their families, and the moments in Black Sabbath when they knew they were changing music forever. Zakk Wylde, his longtime guitarist, visited often, sometimes bringing his guitar so the two could jam softly in the living room. Those close to the family say these visits brought Ozzy joy in a way that even the biggest stadium show could not. Despite his frailty, Ozzy insisted on holding one last recording session in a small private studio not far from his home. It wasn't for an album, wasn't for release, just for himself. He sang a handful of old Sabbath verses, a couple of lines from his solo hits, and a rough, emotional rendition of Changes, a song he had first recorded with his daughter Kelly 2 decades earlier. Those who were there say his voice cracked in places, but the emotion in it was deeper than ever. One engineer called it the sound of a man who had lived every word. When news of his death broke, it was as if the music world collectively stopped breathing. Major television networks cut into their scheduled programming to air breaking news segments. Rolling Stone, Kerrang, and NME each released digital tributes within the hour. BBC Radio dedicated an entire day to his music, weaving in interviews and fan call-ins between songs. In Birmingham, thousands flooded Victoria Square for a spontaneous memorial. Fans carried portable speakers and blasted his music, turning the heart of the city into an open-air concert. People wore everything from classic Sabbath tees to elaborate face paint in homage to his stage persona. Some carried handmade signs that read simply, "Thank you, Ozzy." Around the globe, landmarks lit up in his honor. The Empire State Building glowed a deep purple with gold accents for one night. The Sydney Opera House projected his silhouette across its sails. In Japan, where Ozzy had long been adored, fans gathered outside Budokan Hall to lay flowers and light candles, singing Goodbye to Romance under the glow of paper lanterns. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland announced that its main atrium would feature a month-long installation dedicated to Ozzy's life and career. The exhibit included stage-worn jackets, handwritten lyric sheets, and video reels of his most memorable performances. One section allowed fans to record personal video messages about what Ozzy's music had meant to them. These messages played on a loop, a chorus of voices from all over the world speaking into the silence left by his absence. But perhaps the most emotional memorial came during the next Glastonbury Festival. The organizers had planned a surprise tribute on the Pyramid stage at sunset. As the crowd swelled into the hundreds of thousands, a massive screen showed footage of Ozzy's most iconic performances, from the early Sabbath days to his solo tours, while a live orchestra played "Mama, I'm Coming Home." Thousands of fans, many in tears, sang along. When the final note faded, the crowd erupted into chants of "Ozzy. Ozzy. Ozzy," that seemed to go on forever. Sharon and the Osbourne family released a statement that captured the strange, bittersweet reality of his passing. The world knew him as the Prince of Darkness. We knew him as a husband, a father, a grandfather. He gave everything to his fans and his music, but his greatest gift was his heart. He loved fiercely, forgave quickly, and lived without fear. Privately, the family held a funeral service in Los Angeles, attended by close friends, family, and select figures from the music industry. The service was not a somber affair in the traditional sense. Yes, there were tears, but there was also laughter as people shared outrageous stories of life on the road with Ozzy, the pranks, the mishaps, the moments when chaos turned into pure magic. At the end, everyone raised a glass of Guinness, his drink of choice, and toasted to the man who had somehow made it through more lives than most could dream of. In the months since, his absence has been felt not just in music, but in the very idea of what it means to be a rock star. In an era where so many artists are groomed, polished, and packaged, Ozzy remained stubbornly himself, flawed, wild, unpredictable, but undeniably authentic. His voice, his laugh, his very presence carried with it a reminder that the best art is born from living boldly, even recklessly, and telling the truth about what you've seen along the way. And so, the legend of Ozzy Osbourne lives on in the riffs that still rattle speakers across the world, in the voices of fans who grew up under his sonic spell, and in the stories that will be told for decades to come. He was a man who faced darkness, wrestled it into melody, and handed it back to the world as something beautiful. From the electrified stages of Madison Square Garden to the smoky pubs of Birmingham, from the roar of Black Sabbath to the tender strains of his final recordings, Ozzy's journey was nothing short of extraordinary. He may have left the stage, but his song will never end. And now, as we turn from the pounding drums and wailing guitars of rock and roll, we move into another world entirely, one built on the warm glow of television screens, the laughter of family sitcoms, and the quiet but enduring power of representation. In those who knew him best, the image of Ozzy in his last years is one of contrasts. There was the frail man whose body bore the scars of countless battles with addiction, illness, and injury. But there was also the spark. The glint in his eye that told you the mischievous boy from Birmingham was still very much alive inside. Even as his movement slowed, his mind remained sharp, his humor wicked, and his stories as outrageous as ever. Sharon has shared that in the months leading up to his passing, Ozzy became more reflective than she'd ever seen him. He'd sit for hours in his home studio, a modest space compared to the arenas he once commanded. Surrounded by shelves of vinyl records, stacks of handwritten lyric sheets, and instruments from every era of his career. Sometimes he'd just run his fingers over the spines of old Black Sabbath albums, pull one out, and stare at the cover as though it were an old family photograph. Close friends recall that Ozzy spent more time reconnecting with people from different chapters of his life. He reached out to old road crew members he hadn't spoken to in decades, called former bandmates to reminisce, and even sent surprise messages to young artists who had cited him as an influence. He wanted to make sure everyone knew what they meant to him, said one longtime friend. It was his way of saying goodbye without really saying the words. One particularly touching story emerged from a young British metal singer who received an unexpected phone call from Ozzy one evening. He just said, "I heard your record. It's bloody brilliant. Keep going." And then he hung up, the singer said with a laugh. "I thought it was a prank until Sharon called me back the next day to say he meant every word." That was Ozzy, giving encouragement when it was least expected, leaving a mark in the smallest interactions. Physically, the toll on his body was undeniable. Years of punishing tours, coupled with his Parkinson's diagnosis, had left him often exhausted and in pain. But music was his medicine. Even when he couldn't physically perform on stage, he insisted on being involved in songwriting sessions. Those who worked with him in these final years described him as laser-focused in the studio, no ego, no rock star pretensions, just a man chasing the right note, the perfect lyric. One of the most haunting moments of his final recording session came when he decided to sing Goodbye to Romance one last time. His voice cracked in places, and the high notes weren't as effortless as they had been in his youth, but the emotion in that room was unmatched. People cried quietly behind the mixing board, aware they were hearing the last chapter of something monumental. When he passed, the world's reaction transcended genre. Pop stars, rappers, country musicians, and classical performers alike spoke about his influence. Sir Paul McCartney tweeted, "Ozzy's voice carried truth, grit, and life. He was one of a kind." Elton John called him a true original who lived without compromise. Even symphony orchestras in Europe paid tribute, performing orchestral arrangements of Iron Man and Crazy Train as a nod to his lasting impact. In his hometown of Birmingham, the council moved quickly to honor their native son. Within days, the city announced plans to rename a section of Broad Street, home to the Walk of Stars, as Ozzy Osbourne Boulevard. Murals went up across the city, each capturing a different facet of his persona: the wild-eyed rocker, the loving family man, the elder statesman of heavy metal. The most emotional public tribute came from Tony Iommi, his friend and bandmate for over 50 years. Standing on stage at a memorial concert in Birmingham, Tony held back tears as he spoke. "We fought, we laughed, we made music that changed our lives and the lives of millions. We always said we'd go out together in some way. Now I'm left here, but your voice is still in my head. And it always will be." On the other side of the Atlantic, Los Angeles hosted its own farewell. Thousands gathered at the Hollywood Bowl for a massive all-star concert. Metallica, Judas Priest, Foo Fighters, and even Post Malone performed in his honor, each doing their own take on Ozzy classics. Between sets, video screens played clips from every era of his career. From the grainy footage of early Sabbath gigs to his reality TV days, reminding everyone of the breadth of his reach. But perhaps the most poignant moment came not from a performance, but from silence. As the night drew to a close, the lights dimmed, and a single spotlight illuminated an empty mic stand at center stage. The crowd of tens of thousands fell into absolute quiet. On the screen, Ozzy's face appeared, smiling that crooked smile. As the words "See you on the other side" appeared beneath him. In the weeks following his death, fans around the world shared stories online about what his music had meant to them. A woman from Argentina wrote about how "Mama, I'm coming home" helped her through her father's illness. A soldier from the US spoke of blasting "War Pigs" in his headphones during deployment, saying it gave him courage. A teenager from Japan wrote simply, "I never met him, but he taught me how to be myself." Ozzy's death also sparked renewed discussions about the fragility of icons and the need to preserve their legacies while they're still here. Music historians have pointed out that his career was not just about music, but about cultural defiance, the way he challenged norms, embraced the misunderstood, and turned personal chaos into something universal. Sharon and the Osbourne family have announced plans to release a posthumous box set of rare recordings, demos, and live performances spanning his entire career. Proceeds will go to Parkinson's research and music education programs, causes that Ozzy himself supported quietly in his later years. And so, in death as in life, Ozzy remains a bridge between generations, between genres, between chaos and beauty. He was and will always be the Prince of Darkness. But for millions, he was also a source of light in their own darkest hours. His voice may no longer echo in packed stadiums, but in bedrooms, garages, and headphones across the world, it still lives, defiant as ever. When the last chord of his life rang out, it was not an ending, just the final note of one song in an endless set list. Somewhere, in the collective memory of all who loved him, Ozzy is still on stage, grinning like a troublemaker, shouting, "I love you all," as the crowd roars back. 3. Malcolm-Jamal Warner. For decades, his smile had been a constant in living rooms across America and beyond. Malcolm-Jamal Warner, actor, director, poet, musician, was more than just the sum of his credits. To millions, he was the embodiment of warmth, wit, and quiet strength, the kind of figure who felt like a friend even though you'd never met him. His passing sent a different kind of shockwave. Not the roar of a wrestling arena, not the wail of an electric guitar, but a stillness, a hush, the feeling that something safe and familiar had slipped away. News outlets broke the story in the early hours of a quiet morning. There was no scandal attached, no tabloid frenzy, just the devastating truth that Warner, at 54, was gone. For many, the first images that came to mind were of him as Theo Huxtable, the quick-witted, big-hearted son from The Cosby Show. It was a role he inhabited from the age of 14, growing up on screen alongside the character he played, and growing up with an audience that felt like extended family. But Malcolm-Jamal's legacy was never limited to one role. If Hulk Hogan's world was defined by the roar of the crowd and Ozzy Osbourne's by the thunder of music, Warner's was defined by connection, the quiet, enduring power of storytelling that made people feel seen. Born August 18, 1970, in Jersey City, New Jersey, Malcolm-Jamal Warner was raised by his mother, Pamela, who served not just as his parent, but also his manager in the early years. From the very start, she instilled in him a sense of discipline, focus, and humility, traits that would serve him well when he landed the role that would change his life. When The Cosby Show premiered in 1984, it didn't take long for Warner's charm and comedic timing to shine through. As Theo, he played the relatable middle child, navigating school troubles, family squabbles, and the trials of adolescence. His portrayal was authentic, heartfelt, and, at times, quietly profound. Unlike many child actors, Warner navigated fame with a maturity beyond his years, avoiding the pitfalls that claimed so many of his peers. Over the show's 8-year run, Theo's storylines often dealt with real issues, learning disabilities, financial responsibility, relationships. And Warner brought a sincerity to them that resonated with viewers. Parents saw their own children in him. Young people saw themselves. By the time the series ended in 1992, Malcolm-Jamal had already begun making the transition from teenage sitcom star to serious artist. It was a shift that required careful choices and, as he often admitted in interviews, no small amount of patience. The shadow of a defining role can be a difficult thing to escape, but Warner approached it with grace. Rather than run from his past, he embraced it, while quietly building a body of work that showcased his range. He took on dramatic roles in series like Jeremiah and Sons of Anarchy, appeared in stage productions, and even made guest appearances on shows like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and Dexter. He also stepped behind the camera, directing episodes of The Cosby Show, All That, and Malcolm and Eddie, proving himself as adept in the director's chair as he was in front of the camera. His versatility wasn't just a matter of career survival, it was a reflection of his restless creativity. Music was another passion. Warner was an accomplished bass player and poet, performing spoken-word pieces that explored themes of identity, love, and social justice. His poetry albums earned critical acclaim, and his live performances had the intimacy of a conversation and the rhythm of jazz. Music, he once said, is where I go when I want to tell the truth without anyone interrupting. As he matured, Warner became a mentor for young Black actors navigating Hollywood. He spoke candidly about typecasting, representation, and the importance of owning your narrative. In interviews and workshops, he encouraged up-and-coming performers to protect their integrity above all else. He was also a vocal advocate for mental health and literacy, lending his voice to campaigns and charity initiatives. Former co-stars and collaborators recall how he would take time on set to connect with crew members, learn their names, and ask about their families, small gestures that left a big impact. His advocacy extended beyond entertainment. Warner used his platform to speak about issues affecting the Black community, from systemic racism to economic inequality. He didn't chase controversy, but neither did he shy away from difficult conversations. In his later years, Warner experienced something of a career renaissance. His role as Dr. A.J. Austin on the medical drama The Resident introduced him to a new generation of viewers, many of whom were too young to remember his days as Theo. The role allowed him to showcase his gravitas while still carrying that trademark warmth. Off-screen, he lived a relatively private life with his partner and daughter, fiercely protective of his family's privacy. Friends say that fatherhood was his proudest role, one that brought him a joy deeper than any award or accolade. Everything I do now, he once told an interviewer, is with her in mind. I want her to see that you can build a career without losing yourself. His death, reportedly sudden, stunned those who knew him. Social media filled with tributes not just from actors and directors, but from everyday people who had grown up watching him. Many spoke of how Theo Huxtable had taught them something about empathy, or how Warner's poetry had given them courage. In the days after his passing, television networks aired marathon blocks of The Cosby Show, with special segments dedicated to Warner's life and career. BET, TV One, and PBS each produced hour-long specials, blending interviews with co-stars, clips from his diverse body of work, and readings of his poetry. The Screen Actors Guild released a statement calling him a beacon of professionalism and grace in our industry. His resident co-stars spoke of a man who made every day on set feel like family, even during the most grueling production schedules. A public memorial service was held at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, attended by hundreds of fans and dozens of fellow actors. The stage was adorned with photographs from every era of his career. Teenage Malcolm in Theo's signature sweaters, the confident young director on set, the mature actor at red carpet events. Musicians performed jazz standards and spoken-word pieces in his honor, creating an atmosphere that felt less like a funeral and more like a celebration of artistry. Malcolm-Jamal Warner's story was one of early purpose. Raised in South-Central Los Angeles by his single mother, Pamela Warner, he was no stranger to the realities of working-class life. Pamela, a determined woman who saw both the challenges and the potential of the entertainment industry, steered her son toward acting as both a creative outlet and a possible escape from the limitations of his environment. From the time he was a child, Malcolm was exposed to the discipline of auditions, rehearsals, and performance. He wasn't a kid who stumbled into fame. He earned it through countless hours of preparation, even before the world knew his name. His mother kept him grounded, ensuring that schoolwork and personal development stayed at the forefront, no matter how many Hollywood opportunities came his way. That work ethic would become one of the defining traits of his career. Even when he landed his breakthrough role, it was never about chasing celebrity. It was about telling stories and building something that would last. When The Cosby Show premiered in 1984, it was a cultural event. The series redefined television by presenting an African-American family that was educated, affluent, and loving, a direct challenge to the limited and often damaging portrayals of Black families that dominated media at the time. As Theo Huxtable, Malcolm-Jamal Warner wasn't just playing a character, he was representing an idea. Theo was a teenager who made mistakes, learned from them, and navigated life's challenges with the guidance of a strong family. He had charisma, charm, and humor. But he was also relatable, vulnerable, and at times unsure of himself. The role made Warner one of the most recognizable young actors in the country. He appeared on magazine covers, talk shows, and red carpets, but those close to him knew he remained humble. While other child stars fell victim to fame's temptations, Warner stayed grounded, thanks in part to Pamela's steady hand and his own awareness of the bigger picture. He often spoke about how The Cosby Show was more than just entertainment. It was a statement about what was possible. It was a responsibility, he said in a later interview. We weren't just making people laugh. We were showing them a version of themselves that was often ignored. When the series ended in 1992, Warner faced a challenge familiar to anyone who plays an iconic role: breaking free from it. Hollywood can be quick to pigeonhole actors, and Warner knew he needed to diversify his work to avoid being Theo forever. He took on roles that were intentionally different from the charming teen viewers knew. In the sitcom Malcolm and Eddie, he explored comedic partnership with Eddie Griffin, stepping into the shoes of an entrepreneurial young man navigating adulthood. The series ran for 4 seasons and allowed Warner to showcase his comedic timing while also taking on producing responsibilities, an early sign of his interest in the behind-the-scenes craft of television. Warner also ventured into theater, performing in plays that demanded emotional depth and stage presence. These roles, though less publicized, won him critical praise and demonstrated his range. He began guest starring in a wide array of television shows, moving seamlessly between drama and comedy, from Touched by an Angel to Dexter. By the late 90s, Warner had established himself as a skilled director, helming episodes of All That, Kenan and Kel, and The Cosby Show. His work behind the camera reflected the same professionalism and attention to detail that defined his acting. He had a knack for bringing out authentic performances from his actors, perhaps because he understood firsthand the vulnerability that comes with being on the other side of the lens. He became a sought-after director for television comedies, appreciated for his ability to create a relaxed, collaborative environment on set. Yet, he never abandoned his acting, often juggling both roles on the same production. Warner was more than just an actor and director. He was a multi-talented artist. His love of music led him to become an accomplished bass guitarist, often performing with his own band. He released spoken-word poetry albums, blending music and narrative into powerful meditations on love, identity, and social issues. His 2015 album Selfless and his work with the jazz-funk band Miles Long showed that he wasn't dabbling, he was serious about music. In performances, He moved effortlessly between soulful bass lines and razor-sharp spoken word, commanding the stage in an entirely different way from his television work. Warner's poetry was personal and political. He tackled themes of race, media representation, relationships, and the human condition with the same authenticity he brought to his acting. Fans who knew him only from television were often surprised to discover this other side, raw, unfiltered, and deeply introspective. Warner took seriously his role as a public figure. He mentored young actors, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, offering guidance on navigating the industry without losing one's sense of self. He was a passionate advocate for literacy programs, visiting schools and libraries to encourage reading and creative expression. His own experience growing up in a single-parent household informed his work with youth outreach organizations. He spoke openly about the need for positive male role models, particularly in communities where they were lacking. In Hollywood, he used his influence to push for better representation of Black talent, not just on screen, but in writing rooms and executive offices. He understood that lasting change required voices in positions of power, shaping the narratives from the ground up. In the 2010s, Warner found new critical acclaim with roles in American Crime Story, The People v. O.J. Simpson, where he portrayed Al A.C. Cowlings, and in The Resident, where he played Dr. A.J. Austin. The latter role allowed him to embody a confident, brilliant, and compassionate surgeon, giving audiences a mature, layered performance that proved he had only grown stronger as an actor. This resurgence introduced him to a younger audience, some of whom were discovering his earlier work for the first time. He embraced social media, not for self-promotion, but as a platform to share his poetry, music, and reflections on life. Warner's passing was sudden, and the outpouring of grief was immediate. Co-stars from every stage of his career shared stories of his generosity, humor, and quiet wisdom. Fans posted clips of their favorite Theo moments, scenes from The Resident, and videos of his spoken-word performances, each accompanied by messages of gratitude. Public memorials took place in Los Angeles, New York, and his home city of Jersey City. At the Los Angeles tribute, actors, musicians, and poets shared the stage, reading his work and performing music in his honor. The evening ended with a montage of Warner through the years, set to a live band playing a medley of his favorite jazz standards. The impact of his work was clear. Warner had touched people across generations and across mediums. He had proven that a life in the arts could be about more than fame. It could be about substance, about using your gifts to connect, uplift, and inspire. Malcolm-Jamal Warner's legacy is one of integrity, artistry, and compassion. In an industry that often rewards spectacle over substance, he stood as proof that steady dedication and authenticity could create a lasting mark. His career may have begun with the innocence of a teenage sitcom role, but it evolved into a lifetime of meaningful work that will continue to resonate long after his final bow. For all the familiarity the public felt toward Malcolm-Jamal Warner, the man himself was remarkably private. Unlike many actors whose personal lives became as public as their work, Warner kept a deliberate distance between the spotlight and the parts of himself he considered sacred. That was a conscious choice, shaped by watching peers, especially those who had found fame young, lose themselves in the relentless scrutiny of the media. While his early years in Hollywood placed him alongside some of the biggest names in entertainment, Warner didn't chase the tabloid limelight. He attended premieres, award shows, and industry events, but rarely allowed his off-screen life to become fodder for gossip columns. Friends say he understood the value of mystery, that by keeping his personal relationships and family matters close, he could protect the parts of himself that mattered most. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Warner's dating life occasionally made headlines, but even then, he approached it with a level of discretion uncommon in Hollywood. He was linked to fellow actors and public figures, and one of his most high-profile relationships was with actress Michelle Thomas, remembered for her roles on Family Matters and The Cosby Show. Their relationship was one of deep affection, and those close to both have described it as a bond built on mutual respect and artistic connection. Tragically, Michelle Thomas passed away in 1998 from cancer at just 30 years old. Warner was with her in her final moments, holding her hand as she slipped away. That loss left an indelible mark on him, shaping the way he viewed love, commitment, and the fragility of life. In interviews years later, he spoke with quiet reverence about Thomas, calling her one of the most beautiful souls I've ever known. After Michelle's passing, Warner remained protective of his heart. Though he continued to date, he rarely confirmed relationships publicly, and when he did speak about love, it was often in the context of personal growth. "I've learned that relationships are less about perfection and more about partnership," he once said in a rare candid interview. "It's about finding someone you can build a life with, not just a moment." That philosophy eventually led him to the relationship that would define his later years. While Warner never revealed his wife's name publicly, a choice that reflected his deep commitment to privacy, he confirmed that the two had married quietly, away from the cameras, and had started a family together. If there was one thing that could make Warner speak openly and without hesitation, it was fatherhood. The birth of his daughter transformed him in ways he described as both humbling and inspiring. In one interview, he said, "Being her dad is my proudest achievement. Every decision I make now, every role I take, I'm thinking about how it will affect her, what it will teach her about who her father is." Friends say fatherhood softened him in some ways and sharpened him in others. He became more selective with work, prioritizing projects that allowed him to be present at home. He also became more vocal about issues affecting children and families, lending his voice to campaigns about education, mental health, and fatherhood in the Black community. In the rare moments, he shared glimpses of his family life, a photo of his daughter's tiny hand resting in his, a shot of her perched on his shoulders during a hike. Fans saw a different side of Malcolm-Jamal Warner, the man who was perfectly content to trade red carpet flashes for bedtime stories and playground afternoons. Those who visited Warner's home described it as a warm, inviting space that reflected his artistic spirit. The walls were lined with bookshelves, packed not just with scripts and novels, but with